All right, so we're going to go over genetics today. And so yesterday we went over genetics basics, the basics of genetics over the last couple of days. And today we're going to talk about Punnett squares. You've got a couple slides here that you may have already copied. And then at the end, we're going to do a bikini bottom genetics worksheet, which should be really easy. It'll kind of take you from baby steps or from crawling up to baby steps to walking with genetics. It'll be pretty easy. It'll be good practice. We're going to be doing some work on this in a minute, but let's go ahead and go through the genetics Punnett squares slideshow. So here we go. Genetics is the study of heredity. So you can go and type that out. Genetics is the study of heredity. We've already been talking about this, but I'm just trying to give you some definitions. In your notes, you'll see that I've given you some words to define. As we go over new words to define, you need to be adding those to that slide. So I think there's one or two words that are there. If you come across a word like heterozygous and you don't know what that is, and you don't have that on that slide, then you need to add that word to the slide and then explain in your own words what it is. You're not copying and pasting this definition or just rewriting this definition. You're trying to write it in your own words. So the study of heredity is genetics, and heredity is the passing on of traits from parents to offspring. From parents to offspring, and I think that makes sense. You would expect that you would have some similarities to your parents genetically. Mendelian traits. Mendelian traits, here's some examples. And again, we talked about in genetics, there's going to be some very, very complicated things. So we can talk about skin color. We can talk about hair color. There's some very obvious traits that are not going to be just simply dominant and recessive. So skin color, if a very dark-skinned person and a very light-skinned person have a baby, they're not going to have either a dark-skinned baby and a light-skinned baby. The baby is probably going to be somewhere in between. And if that's the case, because not everything is simply super dominant or dominant or recessive. Some things are going to be, there's things called codominance or incomplete dominance and stuff like that. So you can look at this list, see some things: dimples, free earlobes, baldness. You can see which traits are dominant on the left and which traits are recessive on the right. Again, these are the simple complete dominance and Mendelian traits. There are other things, for example, like hair color. There's brown, there's blonde, there's black, there's red. And even in between those, there's different shades of all those. So it's not just A or B. It could be a whole host of traits and things in between. So genetics can be complicated. We're going to pretend like in our little perfect world that genetics is really, really easy. When we talked about this, the other day. These letters represent the alleles that an organism has. And so this picture is saying that this offspring, this dad or mom, we'll say dad, this parent donated a capital T, a dominant trait, and this parent donated a recessive trait. And if that's the case, then they all had a mixture of that. And the word that we use for this is called heterozygous. We haven't talked about that yet. We'll talk about it shortly. And we got P traits. So P plant traits, you got different seed shapes, different seed color, different heights, how the flowers are positioned, how the leaves are positioned, all kinds of different traits just in the pea plant. And you can think of also some things in your life that you've got that are traits for you that are genetic as well. All right, if you don't already have this, go ahead and write down the definition. If you don't already have this on this slide, I want you to rewrite, not in these words. I want you to try to rewrite. What is a trait? What is a trait? What is an allele? So a trait is something that's a physical characteristic that is determined by genes. Something about you, a characteristic about you that is determined by genes. That is a trait. An allele, remember we talked about genes, the other day. Let's see right here. Right here, you've got these genes, a segment of DNA, and this is in my notebook if you wanted to look at it later. You don't have to copy this and put it as one of your slides, but it is in my notebook. You've got a gene, and you've got two genes, kind of two sister genes, if you want to kind of think about it like that. Two sister genes for every trait that you have, every genetic trait that you have. And so you've got one of those genes you got from your mama, one of those traits you got from your daddy. And so those things, because they're genes, let's say we use the example of a toilet the other day. Let's use a different example. You go to Baskin Robbins or some ice cream place. All the ice cream is given to you in the same exact manner. Either there's a spoon that you scoop it out with, or there's a little lever that you pull. Let's just say you're at a froyo place. You pull the little lever down, you put it in the cup. There, you work it the same exact way, and it's in the same location every time you pull that little thing down, but it's different flavors that are going to come out. And so a gene is going to code for a specific trait. So that may be, let's just say it's brown hair or blonde hair. Let's say there's only two types of hair, brown hair and blonde hair. One trait, one gene may code for brown hair, and you got that from your mom, and the other gene may code for blonde hair. So you got brown and blonde. Depending on which one is dominant and which one is recessive, you're only going to have one of those traits. And that's what Mendelian genetics is. So those alleles are those sister chromosomes, the sister chromosomes that are different forms of the gene, the kind of the different flavors of that gene. All right, so here's some, again, alleles. So you've got a chromosome here, and it's got nice and color-coded. This isn't exactly what your chromosomes look like, but it's nice and color-coded for us here. So let's say this part of the chromosome, you've got eye color. So your mom gave you this eye color, your dad gave you this eye color. From here, you got this from your dad, blonde hair, this from your mom, brown hair. You got height from your dad, that's really short, and your mom, that's really tall. Like whatever, it's the gene, these genes are found in different locations. And if we lived in a really, really, really simple world, we would say that in just one location, your height is determined, or just one location, whether your second toe is bigger than your long toe, that gene is there. But in reality, a lot of your genes are found in multiple places across all of your chromosomes. But again, we're going to pretend like it's just in one easy place. So an allele is a sister gene. This side maybe you got from your mom, this side you maybe got from your dad. These two are alleles because they're coding for the same thing: height, hair color, eye color, stuff like that. All right, so let's watch. So we're going to go through dominant, recessive, genotype, and phenotype. Let's look at these four. So let's look at these four, and then you take notes afterwards. So go ahead and tilt your screens down. You just kind of pay attention for a sec. And then after we go through, we'll do two at a time. So dominant. Dominant, like we talked about, this is the allele. If the allele is dominant, it's going to have the stronger influence over what phenotype or what physical characteristic is. Let me back up. Let me say that again without using a new vocab word. The word dominant means that a gene is there, and if it is there, it is almost like it's going to be yelling what to do. It's going to be yelling what to do. Now, if it's recessive, the word recessive, it's going to be insinuating that it's going to be whispering. If a dominant trait is there, if a dominant gene is there, that gene is going to be determining what you have. So if it's brown hair and blonde hair, if we say brown hair is dominant, if the brown hair gene is present, you're going to have brown hair. So what's the only way you can show the recessive gene? Is if you have, if the dominant gene is not there. So it's if you have both recessive. Let's read the definition. It says, an allele or trait that has more influence, therefore it always appears in an organism if present. So scientists write this with a capital letter. And I wrote down here what we talked about already. Use letters like F and R and A, ones that have a very different capital and lowercase letter. And then recessive is the opposite, an allele that can be hidden or masked if it's paired with a dominant one. We write a lowercase with this. So I think you have a good understanding of this already from what we've talked about. Go ahead and write down what dominant and recessive are in your notes. All right, genotype. Genotype is what we're looking at when we talk about what is actually on the DNA, in the DNA.